Last presentation of the day and last taboo. Does my first slide make you curious, ladies and gentlemen? Or nervous, perhaps? I warn you, there's more to come. Intimacy and sexuality are basic human needs that are intrinsic to people's sense of self and well-being. Regardless of age, individuals require companionship, intimacy and love. Yet for older people, this intrinsic right is often denied, ignored or stigmatized. For older people with dementia, the problem is even worse. They face the double jeopardy of being old and cognitively impaired. In this presentation, I would like to discuss this issue with you, an issue that can rightfully be called a taboo. I will do that by outlining a number of good and bad practices. A prior warning: this presentation contains sexually explicit material, including text and images. So I'd now like to give anyone under the age of 21 the opportunity to leave the room. That's of course an attempt to make an introductory joke about a topic I truly believe is quite serious and utterly relevant to the quality of life of people with dementia. In my introductory lectures to students of the Hague University of Applied Sciences on the topic of aging, I always show the first scene of the movie Wolken 9. The title of this German movie from 2008 refers to the English expression "I'm on cloud 9", which means something like "I'm very happy". This movie tells a beautiful love story. Of course, countless films have been made about love, which plays an important role in all of our lives, but the main characters in most movies are young and beautiful people. But in this movie, Wolken 9, the lovers are over the age of 80. It is a lovely and touching movie that starts with a sex scene on the floor of the man's apartment. We see two elderly people making love, well acted and tastefully filmed. The response of the 20-year-old students is not surprising. They start giggling and cheering. These are their facial expressions. When I ask the students why they respond this way, I get two types of answers. The majority finds the scenes distasteful, while the minority finds it touching. I confront the students by saying that, in my mind, both reactions are equally odd, and I ask them to honestly answer whether they would have responded differently if the actors had been young and beautiful. They admit this without hesitation. I get similar reactions when I show them photographs taken by the famous Dutch photographer Marie Bot. This photographer created a beautiful report entitled "Timeless Love", in which she portrays the intimacy and sexuality of elderly people. This picture appeals to an ideal and accepted image, and consequently, the students are of the opinion that it is beautiful and touching. Here you see Jack and Lizzie, ages 84 and 85. They've been married for 60 years, and here they are spooning in bed. It is a picture that portrays their trust, intimacy, and love. But oh my, if the pictures also have a sexual connotation. This picture brings laughter to the classroom, and the giggling reaches gale force when this explicit picture is shown, which, incidentally, depicts a common sexual activity. And I'm glad you are not laughing, ladies and gentlemen. Apparently, intimacy and sexuality in older people is a strange and emotionally charged phenomenon for young students. But these are only photographs. I'd now like to share a few real-life stories. This is a picture of my father. He suffered from dementia for the last 7 years of his life. You see him here with my eldest daughter. At this point, he didn't recognize her, he didn't know she was his granddaughter, but you see the intimacy in this picture. With the support of my brother and me, my mother took care of him at home until it was no longer possible. He lived in a nursing home the last year of his life. By that time, he had advanced dementia. One day, the nursing home physician called me to say that there was a problem at night with my father, and this is what he said. Your father gets out of bed at night and crawls into bed with other people. My first response was, is that a problem? A rather intelligent question, I think. And my question was met with silence on the other side. Of course, said the physician, it's a problem, because the other people are not amused, get scared or angry, and push him out of their beds. I had to admit that the physician was right. Some might perceive this as a problem. At the nursing home, I asked the nurses whether there was a sexual component to my father's behavior. They empathically denied it. Your father crawls into bed with both men and women, they said, and if he's not pushed out by the other person, we find the two of them happily fast asleep, side by side. I went back to the physician and said to him, I think I understand my father's behavior. He slept next to my mother for 60 years. Before that, when he was a kid, he shared a bed with his brothers, as he grew up in a large, poor family. He did not have his own bed and has never slept alone in his whole life. So I suggested that he was now waking up at night and feeling the need for the reassuring presence of another human body. He's looking for intimacy, I told the physician. I then returned to the nurses and asked them which other patients enjoyed having my father crawl into bed with them. They turned out to be 2 men and 2 women. So I talked to their families and explained the situation. 2 of the 4 families, one of the men and one of the women, had no problem with them sleeping together as long as both persons benefited from it. Fortunately, the nurses shared this sentiment. And so, for the last year of his life, my father slept with alternating partners, to everyone's satisfaction. And my mother was okay with it, because she understood his need. Research into the quality of life of people with and without dementia has convincingly shown that the need for social contact, affection, attachment, intimacy and sexuality is essential. In a study conducted by Dreus, Hoogeveen and others, people with dementia were asked what they considered important regarding their quality of life. The response listed in this slide were mentioned most often, but can be illustrated even better and with greater impact with a number of images. Incidentally, affection, attachment, and intimacy can come in many forms. For example, what about Jo, who you see here, age 96, with advanced dementia and in the final months of her life? Her 70-year-old daughter gave her a baby doll. Just look at her response, look at her face. One of my students said the following about these pictures. When I see these pictures, I don't see an old, demented woman with a doll, but I see a mother with her child. And I agree with her. And what about Mary Lou, age 92? In the picture in the upper left, she looks fearful and sad. But she has a wonderful smile in the bottom right picture. I took these pictures within a time span of only 10 minutes. How can her mood change so radically within such a short time? That's because we know how to make this happen. Mary Lou was very much in love with her husband, to whom she was married for 65 years. Sadly, he is no longer alive. But because of her dementia, Mary Lou doesn't know this. She never talks about him anymore, but her brain seems to still know that she loved him. And those feelings of love can be evoked by smells. For his entire life, her husband used the same brand of aftershave, Old Spice. I don't know if you know it. This brand is still available. So if we put a drop of Old Spice on a handkerchief and let Mary Lou smell it, she becomes happy 4 out of 5 times. Experiencing intimacy is vital for the quality of life of people with dementia. And this may include sexual behavior as well. I'd like to present you with 2 cases. One very bad practice and one good practice. The first one. Mrs. Mills and Mr. Burns live in the same psychogeriatric ward of our nursing home. Mr. Burns is a friendly but somewhat dominant man. Both of them have adult children. A few days after Mrs. Mills is admitted, she and Mr. Burns come into contact. It is not clear who made the first move, but those who observe them see a couple in love. They walk through the ward hand in hand all day long, lean against each other on the sofa and are fond of caressing each other. The staff's initial response is mixed. Naturally, they want Mrs. Mills and Mr. Burns to be happy, but they also have their doubts and a number of questions. Isn't this an extremely awkward situation? After all, Mrs. Burns' wife, whom he loved very much, died only 3 months ago. And Mrs. Mills still has a husband, even though their relationship is not a good one. We discuss it with their children. They see the relationships between their respective parents on a daily basis and understand it. Yet they also find it troubling, and one of the daughters expresses the feeling they all share as follows. As long as it doesn't go beyond holding hands and pecks on the cheek, I don't have a problem with it. Mr. Mills has not yet visited his wife since she was admitted. To his son, who has informed him about the situation, he says, I don't want to see her for a while because I don't know how I will respond. In the meantime, Mrs. Mills and Mr. Burns seem to be very happy together. Mr. Burns sometimes calls her Sue, the name of his deceased wife, but he is mostly aware that this is his new girlfriend. Mrs. Mills says, I've met another boy, and he's so sweet. The children recognize that their affection seems to be positive for both of them. But it does not stop at innocent caressing. Mrs. Mills and Mr. Burns do more than that. Other residents and visitors often see them shamelessly making out on the sofa in the living room and are opposed to this. They also find their way to one of the bedrooms more and more, where more explicit sexual activities take place. The children are understanding to a certain point, even though they have expressed that they find more extreme sexual behavior unacceptable. And the opinions and feelings of the staff are mixed too. In the meantime, Mrs. Mills and Mr. Burns are not aware that they are doing anything wrong and refuse to be reprimanded. All in all, the tension continues to grow, and one day this leads to a shouting match in the ward between 2 daughters. After 3 months of increasing problems, Mrs. Mills is transferred to a different ward. In the new ward, she is sad and defiant. She appears to understand what has happened a lot better than most people think. When she is asked why she is so sad, she says no more than, "It was better before. Now it's one big mess." But when Mr. Burns is mentioned, she sincerely says that she misses him and that she thinks it's horrible that they are being kept from each other. When I see him, she says, they'll physically stand in front of me. I call this a very bad practice with an unfortunate ending to those involved directly. But a happy ending is also possible. Mr. Benson, age 86, lives in a nursing home. He has had dementia for 5 years, but was cared for at home by his wife until recently. That ended abruptly when she took a nasty fall on the street and broke her hip. She had to recover for several months and afterwards moved into a convalescent home that, together with her husband's nursing home, forms a care center. Mr. Benson no longer recognizes his wife. and this saddens her. She tells us that she had a very good marriage and that he was a sweet and caring man. When Mrs. Benson visits her husband, everything goes just fine. He does not know who she is, but good-heartedly accepts her caring for him. And she appears to accept the situation. But then something unexpected happens. We often see Mr. Benson in the company of Mrs. Smith, a woman with dementia who also lives in his ward. They have become close and walk through the ward hand in hand. Mrs. Smith does not appear to be a flash in the pan. The bond between her and Mr. Benson grows stronger. They seek out each other's company more and more and show each other signs of affection. Mrs. Benson also notices this, but does not say anything. I asked to speak to her and prepare myself to explain how this kind of bond between two people with dementia can develop. But I'm mistaken. Mrs. Benson beats me to the punch. She says, "I know what you want to talk to me about my husband and Mrs. Smith. I find it difficult to see, I admit, but I also see that it does him good. And you know what? He has my blessing because I love him so much." Her response really moved me. Then she said, "But I do have a request of you. I visit him every other day between 2:30 and 4:30. Could you make sure that that woman is not around, because otherwise it's difficult for me to get through to him?" "Of course," I reply, "we can do that." And that's exactly what we did. In conclusion, experiencing intimacy is vital for the quality of life of people with dementia. This may include sexual behavior as well. Professional caregivers should be aware of this and help to allow the fulfillment of these basic human needs. Thank you for your attention.